autistic savant. After he's able to rescue her, what she considers to be abnormal behavior is explained by Jamil through a series of flashbacks. It makes more sense as to the trajectory of his behavioral patterns in such a lateral direction the more she learns about Jamil as the story progresses. Very good question. Well, initially I didn't, but what I noticed was out of the people that have since read and reread the book multiple times, it tends to be those who either have someone in their family who has high or low functioning autism, who tends to be high in empathy, and those who have a love of a combination of poetry and prose, because each line in the book represents a compressed paragraph in the original writing, and someone who's used to or admires that type of writing seems to have read the book multiple times and has sent me many endearing emails representing as such. Irrespective of how difficult the world may seem, especially for someone who is almost someone who's come from another planet, it is possible to traverse the world understanding that the world is itself a tragedy. And there are times when, especially in Jamil's case, one who is relatively mentally impaired and yet simultaneously is more lovable, more humorous and more successful in life than, say, someone who might think they have it all. It is a great way to prevent oneself from falling down the path of resentment, because the world really is tragedy or hell, and it's much easier to be tragedy when you realize that you're not the only one who has to go through such a dark time. Jamil and his brain, and in the autistic's brain, there tends to be not much understanding of risk, and that has a lot to do with not realizing how one is perceived as the autist, or in general the idea of perception. And so they will do what seems logically correct to them, not being aware that it can be giving off a completely wrong impression to other people. And that's because we as humans are pattern-seeking individuals and will prefer a junk theory to no theory at all, if I'm to quote an author much better than I am. And so when he decided to see the Great River, as the name was, which was the border between Syria and his parents' beautiful homeland of Lebanon, he didn't realize that just wanting to see the Great River was not an excuse that would be believable. And so it started with even the taxi drivers not believing him and automatically assuming that he was trying to sneak into Syria for some reason. Now, he wasn't aware of this at all, so when he reached the wall that he was sent to, he just assumed that there is a wall with a ladder and that's how you get into Syria, not realizing that that was actually an illegal border crossing. And what made it worse was that when he had the gun to his head in Syria and they asked him why you were here, he actually said what he considers was correct, which was that he came to see the big river and to see how big it was. From the neurotypical mind's perspective, that is not something that seems believable, so of course they naturally assumed he was lying and interrogated him even further. It was both hilarious and a tragedy at the same time, hence the theme of the book. We are still in a phase where we don't know what we don't know about autism, and we still can assume that as a society in general are unable to tell the difference between someone who's autistic and someone who is a sociopath, which are the complete reverse of each other. Whereas there has been gallops forward, and the readers will know as well when they see what happened to Jamil in the 80s and 90s and what the teachers did to him, assuming that he was just a malicious person when in fact he was the exact opposite. When I travel around now and speak to a lot of mothers with autistic children about what happens in school, I see none of that. A lot of people might at least ask themselves, is this child autistic? Do they see the world differently? And that is something I'm pretty sure was not around during the 80s and 90s when the story was told. I would submit that it is the most powerful book on autism as of yet, specifically because it is written from the perspective of Jamil Levant, one of the only autistics with savantism, which has allowed him to articulate the story from a first-person perspective in a way that we would never really see. The book is told in flashback form, so things tie together as you get to the end. In the beginning, which is actually later on in terms of chronological timeline, Jamil is escaping Syria at the time that ISIS was rising up, and he was in Damascus in 2012, and by this time his Arabic had become quite fluent, so he was able to make it in and make it out. But once again, despite all of his knowledge, had no understanding that number one, that was ISIS, or number two, his life was under threat being in Damascus. Other places were the amazing Mediterranean Sea, significant portions of the Christian sections of Lebanon where his family were from. He also traveled into Hezbollah territory as well as Sunni Muslim sections as well, and met amazingly beautiful people and cultures, not being aware that that's what he was doing, mind you. Of course, Australia, Sydney, a little bit of China, that is to do around his ex-fiancée, who was one of the people that changed his life dramatically. The largest tragedy is the impending doom, which is implied at the end of the book, which will be released in the second chapter. So I was a classical pianist by trade growing up. That's how I was defined. I ended up studying a few different languages. I started with Arabic, followed by Hebrew, followed by French, then Italian, and then a little bit of biblical Greek. I became a relatively successful DJ in the region, and after that I decided to become a personal trainer and bartender amongst other things, and a translator. And then after that I decided to test my skills not only flying a plane, but then to go back to uni and complete a mathematics and physics degree, which I did 2 weeks ago. I just knew that it had to be whole. Jamil having a relationship for the first time in his adult life, and so that really allowed him to understand humans through the eyes of his girlfriend Adrienne, not taking for granted simple things like going to a store and being able to block out sounds that the autistic cannot do, and thus have to wear things like earplugs. His rapid learning ability, Jamil's ability to learn a language within a handful of hours and then become a native and then teach that language at the very same school that he was studying that language, and in fact it was 2 languages at the same time, is something that I think most people like me found breathtaking. And it was the only reason that he was able to learn human behavior in such a conscious way, which is what we now call society and the complexities of society. Volume 2, it's called The 5 Years Exile. The writing is even more potent than in the first book. The graphic implications of the first book, for example, the powerful situation of the suicide, even though it happens in the first book, the continuation of the effects via Jamil and his family in the second book are things that really people who are thinking of attempting suicide may not have taken into account, and it may help them think twice. The second book is about the 5 years exile, where Jamil is entrapped away from his family and friends, not understanding what for. But it turns out that the tradition that the first book provides for us is that Jamil is constantly accused and suffers the punishment for things that he did not do because he is misunderstood as being a neurotypical as opposed to being autistic. That is metastasized and is exacerbated in book 2. It is now the government actually that is holding him for 5 years, and I have been able to learn significant new information about how autistics can suffer criminal suspicion for things that they would never be capable of conceiving, and yet they still suffer the severe consequences of one who actually did intend to do something wrong. The end of the second volume is either the placing in jail or the freedom of Jamil, and as of yet we still don't know that he will be found to be autistic in the eyes of the law, because it has never happened at all in the Western world that we know of in such a unique case. You touch on a brilliant point, which is that, in my biased opinion, it was not something that was quite obvious, and that undiagnosis is what resulted in such a dramatically disastrous and yet beneficial for everyone else life that Jamil had to go through, and of course others that are around, perhaps not at the savant level that, where it might be easier to detect, but even then, you're right, it's not something that would have been picked up for a long time. A lot of people have come up to me and have told me about their children who are 17 and 18 and they're just getting diagnosed. They suffered severe amount of stress and bullying at school, etc., that they would perhaps not have suffered otherwise. That is so true. Rick, you've made my day, thank you. I do have signed copies available, which I would sign personally for people if they're happy to go to paypal.me/gabsmacked, GABSMACKED. It'll be free postage as well, and it's $28 American. I'll cover the postage and sign a copy for them. They just have to put their address in there and let me know who they would like me to make out the signed copy to. And yes, I do have live casts on Periscope and YouTube. So on periscope.tv/gabsmacked, where I talk a lot about autism and people call in and talk about their experiences with autism, where I give book tours and speeches, etc. The highlighted versions are available through YouTube. Just search Gabsmacked, GABSMACKED, and you'll be able to find some great autism playlists there, and I do other things like quantum mechanics, etc., which some people might love to torture themselves with. Rick, that was great. Thank you. You had beautiful questions, and it was great to be taken care of like that, so I really appreciate your time.
All right, don't forget to live your life fabulous. Yeah.
We gon' fly, yeah, and we gon' soar, yeah. Tonight is